Good evening, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the World Government Summit COVID-19 and Government webinar series. Today's session is titled, How Social Change in the COVID-19 Pandemic Inspires Better Governance. Today, I'd like to take great pleasure in welcoming our two esteemed panelists, Professor Cass Sunstein, Harvard Law Professor and the author of Nudge, and Abdulaziz Al-Jaziri, Deputy CEO and Chief Operating Officer of Dubai Future Foundation and CEO of Palmwood. In the meanwhile, I'd like to remind everyone to please place your questions in the Q&A and please state where you are sending your questions in from. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the session. Abdulaziz Jaziri, handing over to you.
Thank you, Reem. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Our session is going to cover how social change in the COVID-19 pandemic inspires better governance. A really interesting topic for me personally, but I'm sure just as interesting for a lot of you joining us today. 5 months after the first outbreak, COVID-19 is still dominating our lives. Unlike other strains of viruses, the novel coronavirus has not only been acting as a leveler, it has also been an amplifier of the long-existing economic and social variations that cross societies, multiplying the danger of this pandemic and triggering a vicious cycle of overwhelming consequences. Today, as a collective community, we are faced with unprecedented times, with challenges that span every system we once depended on. The enormity of the situation the pandemic has forced upon us surpasses the need for not just a more robust healthcare system, but is unveiling the need to reflect on the nature and effectiveness of our social systems of governance, the governance of our very complex societies. Through the World Government Summit, we're seeking, through these series of sessions with thought leaders, to answer some of the most pressing questions that enable us to foresee beyond the pandemic, to inspire and see opportunities that allow us to fix, amend, build, and hopefully reinvent the new norm now. In our current situation, the central governance issue involves getting people to divert from their normal routines in the name of public health goals. In some cases, they're even asked to forego engaging in activities that provide daily sustenance. This highlights the importance of assessing the strengths and weaknesses of the different models of governance, which are being put to the test by leaders, as they are confronted with extremely difficult choices to contain the spread of COVID-19. To shed light and add value to our discussion today, I'm honored to join you all in welcoming Professor Cass Sunstein, founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. Amidst the extensive daily follow-up of those grooming numbers of corona cases from around the globe, it can't be more fitting to be here with the founder of the nudging theory. Professor Sunstein was the administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs from 2009 to 2012. He has been involved in constitution making and law reform activities in a number of nations and serves now as an advisor to the Behavioral Insights team in the UK. So, Professor, before we start with any questions, I would truly enjoy your thoughts on this topic.
It's a great honor to be participating in this discussion, and thank you so much for that kind invitation. People all over the world are facing an unprecedented challenge, and it's not only a problem, though it's certainly that, it's also an opportunity. So I'd like to organize these opening remarks under one word, and the word is sustainability. And by sustainability, I mean to include environmental improvements and that kind of thing, but I mean sustainability in a much larger sense. Sustainability of governance, sustainability of life, sustainability of economies. And under that title, I want to talk about three things. The first is good nudges. The second is less sludge. And the third is just a simple word, better. In some governance, there's a little phrase, some governments, there's a little phrase, better is good. And the phrase is meant as a note of optimism under very challenging circumstances. Sometimes you can't solve a problem, but you can make it better. Better is good. There are in many places all over the world now signs in grocery stores that have a 2-meter separation, two human beings separated by 2 meters, and the words accompanying the sign say something like, "It is your duty to protect the staff and other people." the evidence suggests that that little simple sign of two people separated by 2 meters with the words, "It is your duty to protect other people and the staff," those things are saving lives. They are a nudge. What's meant by a nudge is that they are like a GPS device. They are simple, clear communications that don't by themselves force anybody to do anything, but give people a signal of what they ought to do if they want to protect themselves. We can think of nudges as small interventions that can move communities and sometimes whole populations. They can move nations. A warning is a nudge. A reminder is a nudge. When we think of the problems that are being faced today, social distancing, staying at home, washing your hands, these are things where nudges are essential, either as a means for enforcing a prohibition or a mandate, or as an alternative to a prohibition and a mandate. What we're seeing in many places, and this is a sign of hope and optimism in a difficult time, is co-creation, where nudges are not designed only by some very intelligent government official, but they're being designed with close engagement with citizens. If they are old and then especially vulnerable, poor, and therefore very challenged by life, facing some sort of cognitive problem, maybe they're sad or scared, or maybe they have some sort of language problem, to work with them to co-create the nudge can be essential to making it effective. There is a framework all over the world now. It's called the EAST framework. It's very simple. E means easy, A means attractive, S means social, and T means timely. And if you remember anything from these remarks, I hope it's the letters E and S, where E means easy and S means social. Such successes as we're observing in many nations are made possible because people find it easy to do what is the safer thing, whether it's finding a mask or staying home or finding a way to wash their hands. The S in the EAST framework is even better. It is social. And the idea here is that people really care what the social norm is. There's evidence that suggests people want to protect themselves, to be sure. But if they think they're endangering others, then their attention really is triggered. They don't want to endanger other members of their community. So to signal there's a new social norm here and people are generally following it is a life-saving strategy. I want to add, and I'm very aware that it's Ramadan, one letter to the EAST framework, and it's the letter F. So the word is feast, and a feast is coming. The idea is that sometimes it's very hard to make challenging situations fun, but it is not hard to make them endurable or pleasant or a part of a social commitment. In New Zealand, the Prime Minister has said, "We are a team of 5 million." That's a beautiful thing to say. It unifies diverse people, and it says we are involved in a common endeavor. It's not exactly fun to fight a pandemic, but it can be scary or terrifying, or people can lose hope. To have a sense of confidence and hope is a very important nudge, both for well-being and for doing better with the problem. Sludge consists of frictions, paperwork, or administrative burdens that governments impose in good faith. My government certainly does it, but they are under current circumstances excessive. I'll give you a couple examples of sludge removal. And I want to suggest that for sustainable government right now, taking away unjustified sludge can be a life-saving strategy. For some programs in the world, to get benefits, you need to have an in-person interview. Some governments are saying, you don't have to have that in-person interview anymore. That's removing sludge and it's very important under difficult conditions. Some governments are giving benefits automatically, where previously people had to go through very complicated paperwork requirements. They automatically get the benefits. And that might mean some people get the benefits who don't deserve it, but that's okay under conditions in which if they don't get the benefits, maybe they'll get very sick, or maybe their economic situation will be catastrophic. My government has had a sustained effort to remove paperwork and reporting and administrative burdens from people in multiple domains. And that is helping people to survive or to get medical help. So the basic idea is that under circumstances in which people are really struggling, to take away sludge as a priority, to have a kind of sludge audit of your government, can be a way of helping people who are in very difficult conditions and of making government more sustainable. One little note on that the best idea, I think, in social science in the last 10 years points to the scarcity of the human mind. That for all of us, we can't focus on everything. And under conditions of poverty or illness or distress, the amount of mind capacity we have to devote to problems, it's just limited. And the pandemic has been increasing the scarcity problem for populations under the world, all over the world. If you take away sludge, administrative burdens and frictions, you can make space for people who are facing that scarcity problem to live their lives more manageably. Okay, my last point has to do with better, and I mean better with respect to sustainability. There's an old adage in sports, which is to turn a negative into a positive. And this is a real chance to do that. First category, we can make government much more efficient under conditions in which people often are having to do what we're doing now, that is meet online rather than in person. We can have fewer meetings in person. We can have more efficient meetings in person. We can do much more online than we've ever done before. That can be a blessing, not a curse. It's not only good, but it can save time and money and increase the possibility for interacting with people who might not otherwise have had a chance to make their voice heard in government. And here the idea is there's an unprecedented chance to recognize dignity of all of members of the human species and to treat people with respect, just by virtue of increasing contact and increasing efficiency. The second point is sustainability in the more usual sense. We can have fewer emissions, lower levels of emissions. We can have bike lanes instead of automobile traffic. We can have cleaner air. We are having now, in many parts of the world, cleaner air. And while this isn't the right reason for having cleaner air, it's because of the economic slowdown, it is showing there's a potential to unleash human creativity and to make life very manageable in ways that reduce the risks associated with air pollution and greenhouse gases. The very final point has to do with constitutional understandings. And we can understand this to mean literally a constitution, or we can understand it to mean our highest aspirations as a nation. We can think of a right to a more efficient government as part of what a good constitution includes. We can think of a right to healthcare, not meaning everybody gets healthcare. That might be too difficult in some places, but as an aspiration. We can think of a right to health precautions as something which is a constitutional aspiration, which can focus citizens and government on sustainability here in the literal sense of a longer life. Okay, I have a question for you before we have discussions, and I also have a tentative answer. So the question is, what is the most precious commodity that members of the human species have? what is the one thing that's the most precious that we have? There are many good answers, but I suggest that at least the short list of good answers has one word: time. Let's find a way to give people more of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Your talk just gave me a lot of questions, and I want to dig deeper into what you've been saying. And before we take any Q&As from the participants, I believe we have a poll now coming up on the screen for all of the participants to take part of. And as soon as that comes, we can start with some of the questions that I have. Maybe till that is up, Professor, you said some interesting words at the beginning when you were talking about what New Zealand has done. You said the word hope. And in your opinion, Professor, how can we design hope during these terrifying times and bring hope during these terrifying times?
Okay, so one thing that's clear is that emotions are contagious. So if leaders suggest a sense of desperation or despair, that's going to be contagious for the population. If leaders give a sense, well, President Roosevelt, one of America's presidents, said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And while that's not literally true, it's possibly the greatest sentence in any speech by any American president, because people thought, we can get through this. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And so if a leader is saying, we've confronted various problems before, they're terrible, look where our country, those were terrible, look where our country is now compared to where our country was 50 years ago. And for much of the world, the answer is there have been amazingly positive developments. So to suggest that this is a serious challenge, but that it's being managed, to point to bright spots, that is periods in the last weeks where a community has done better and reduced contagion, that can induce hope. So both to display hope and to give reasons for hope.
Great, thank you, Professor. You also touched upon the role of technology during these times and how it's been impacting education, healthcare, and so on. But I believe, and I've seen this in parts of your talks before, you spoke about how sometimes people look at the data and make decisions on behalf of the community, but sometimes data isn't a law. And can you please tell us more about that?
Well, data is part of the picture for policies to control COVID-19. So we're learning that some strategies work better than others. But the data won't tell us how people are feeling. It won't, and I don't mean now about whether they're being sick, but I mean whether they are feeling desperate or angry, or respected or optimistic. So the data gives us numbers which are essential, but to get a sense of people's emotional reaction to the situation in which they find themselves is essential. And it's easy to neglect for all public officials. So if you have a population that's staying at home and washing their hands, but they are feeling terrified and in despair, the data won't capture that unless you engage with them. And you can engage with them and compile data, that would be good. But to engage with them and listen to them and is a way of showing respect and also learning things that can lead to better policies. And as I say, New Zealand has been very good on that, where the Prime Minister has listened to people and given people a sense, we're going to get through this. And as of now, the health situation in New Zealand is very good.
Great, thank you, Professor. You said there's a lot of aspirations that are going to come out after COVID-19, from aspiring that every person in the world has access to healthcare and so on and so forth. What other industries do you believe we should aspire to, and maybe goals we're aspiring for that would come out of COVID-19, and things that we've seen that we can live with and live without during these times?
What a great question. So the word sustainability right now is understood in some ways broadly, but in some ways narrowly. It refers to climate change and the environment and that kind of thing. But we might be coming to a time when sustainability is a much broader idea, that reflects a right to protection from some of the problems associated with old age, for example, or some of the problems associated with cognitive decline or mental illness, physical pain. These are things which we haven't thought of, and whether to think of them in terms of rights or something more like an aspiration or a duty of public officials. Different people will think of this differently, but it all converges on the same, which is to think what makes for a dignified life, or whatever word is the culturally best word that captures a life in which people are treated with respect and seen that their days are ones that they're not only enjoying but feeling purpose in. So I think something about purpose and welfare, well-being. Well-being is better than welfare.
100%. I think, Professor, in my role at Palmwood, we truly believe in co-creating with citizens. And I've seen in the UAE, we've been doing that extensively. So in the past year, during the annual government meetings where more than 400 to 500 people from all governments, local and federal in the UAE, come together to look at what the future of the UAE is supposed to be. And last year, we included every part of society, from teachers to students, to mothers and fathers, to doctors, and somehow to come and design with us what we believe is the long-term vision for this country. But how do you see nudging, in your opinion, and co-creating being different or similar, and what will these trying times change the way we think about governance?
So if you think of the government's tools, it can require, it can say people have to do certain things, it can prohibit, it can say people can't do certain things, it can fine or tax, or it can subsidize. Those are tools. Or it can nudge. It can warn, it can remind, it can inform, it can simplify. And none of those things forbid or require or tax or subsidize. For all of them, co-creation is a very promising idea. So if you're going to forbid people, let's say, from opening stores in a certain period, to work with them and talk to them, and to get a sense of what their concerns are is useful. And you may learn something, like there are some stores that really shouldn't be closed in this time, even if they're not selling food. If there's a nudge, let's say it's a communication that is designed to get people to be separate in grocery stores, you need to know whether it's going to work. And if you just consult your friends in government, let's say, or your colleagues, you won't know enough. It's very important to learn from the people who are going to see the communication, whether it's something that they find helpful. If you're having something that switches, let's say, from people have to apply to people automatically get some benefit, or from something where the application is pretty complicated to the application is very simple, in either of those cases, to engage with people, co-creation can be indispensable. So I'll tell you something I was involved in Washington, which is there are forms which people face for many things. It might be licenses, it might be permits, it might be educational benefits. And we set out the forms, but we didn't co-create the forms. And so we had a project in Washington where we co-created the forms. We worked with people, just as you described, from all walks of life, and asked them, can you help us create better forms? And they weren't, particularly educated. They weren't working for the government, but they knew a lot more than we did about what forms what problems forms would create.
Good. Professor, we have a question from Her Excellency Hasla Ahmed, who's the Minister of Community Development. I think Her Excellency was part of the work that I was telling you about designing for old people, and then we shifted that from designing for ourselves as we age. So her question is, how can we reteach the society and get them to unlearn what we went through during this pandemic?
Thank you, Your Excellency. That's a great question. I think to have simple communications that nudge people toward, let's say, an improved normal can work. So some places in the world, there's discussion of a phased transition to more like normal. And then to say, At this stage, you can do this and that. And at the next stage, you're going to be able to do these other things. And at the third stage, you're going to be able to do all these things. And these things are moving in the direction of something other than what we're now facing. But to have them described in a way that's very clear, that's optimistic and hopeful, that suggests an end that is very good and normal or better than normal, that should work. And your point about co-creation is essential, especially because different demographic groups are going to have different reactions. It might be that certain people will go back to normal very quickly, whereas others will be very frightened, or maybe they will form a habit. And to communicate, there's the new norm is this, with evidence from what people are doing that is the new norm, can be very effective.
I think just based on what you're saying, Professor, I was reading online that COVID-19 is going to end socially before it ends medically, because people are dying to go back to their normal lifestyle. And I think as much as possible, from the stuff we've been hearing in China of revenge shopping, where people just want to go back and spend, I think a lot of it's going to take some time for us to go back to some kind of normal that we've been used to.
Yes, and there is a risk that as soon as things start to open up some, they might open up too much, meaning people will be aggressive and running risks and inflicting risks on others. And there are ways to avoid that aren't severe, by suggesting to people that you're inflicting risks on your neighbors and possibly your own family. Be sensible.
True. And your phased approach is a perfect way to take that forward, I believe. Professor, we have another question from the UE, and the question is, how can we balance the conflict between the social structures and the social systems that could be considered the key determinant of individual, social, and governmental responsibilities and duties?
Well, if what's meant is the norms that create a well-functioning society. Here's a little idea. This is like a small idea as an approach to a large question. There's recent evidence suggesting that while people are influenced by the existing social norm, they are in some cases even more influenced by what they say is the emerging or coming social norm. So if people think, most people are washing their hands a lot, or most people are staying home, that's effective. But if people are told people are increasingly washing their hands, or people are starting to, let's say, go out more, that can be very, very effective. And so what I'm thinking is, if the emerging norm can be one that respects both sides, the values, if I understand, that keep society functioning well and people interacting well with each other, and the current imperatives, if there are emerging practices that reflect that, that can be very good. Here's just one little example, and I'm hoping that people who are listening will think of many examples that suit their circumstances. That in California, Los Angeles, people have taken now, just by themselves, to riding bicycles to go to the grocery stores. And the reason they're doing that is it's good exercise, and they need exercise, and they want to get to the place where there's food. And that's creating a new norm, which can be long-lasting. And everything is being respected by that norm, so long as they are careful bike riders.
Great, Professor. Professor, in any case during these times, I think behavior of citizens and the communal behaviors of society is extremely important, and nudging is a vital tool to do so. But I believe as governments go ahead and try to contain and shift behaviors going forward, what is the most neglected human behavior that governments ignore?
Okay, the most neglected one. I'm going to think for a few seconds.
Take your time.
I think the most neglected one is that human beings are very attentive to stories. So what we're learning is that, consistent with your point, data isn't everything, and that's true for public officials. For the ordinary person, actually all of us in our ordinary lives, a story is more powerful than a number. So if you like to get people to stay home, to tell them, I have a friend who's 75 years old, and she went out and she's now in the hospital with COVID-19. Even as I say that, I'm starting to think I should stay home for the next 5 years. So I think we neglect the immense power of stories, including public officials.
I think, Professor, this brings me to another question that we have from Australia, where the question is, how does media play a role in this pandemic? How do we integrate, what's the integration between media and government? And from the angle of building stories and giving stories and building hope for society.
So media can be extremely helpful. So some media is independent of government, some media is involved in government, and in either case, it can be extremely effective, and in many countries it has been extremely effective in publicizing risks and good strategies. So you can think of media as a, in the Olympic Games of nudging, media gets either bronze, silver, or gold. They are very much involved. They enter into the World Cup of nudging, the media. And if they're working with government or if they're working separately, they can be essential, both to helping people under very difficult conditions and in helping people to transition out of the circumstances that many countries are now in. Media can also be a problem, however, if they are disseminating information that's not true. If they're saying, the COVID-19 isn't a serious problem and you should go out and wearing a mask is a foolish thing. So a lot depends on exercise of responsibility as well as alertness. And this is something that we haven't seen yet. We will in the next few years. Media understanding more about human behavior. So, for example, we know that on average, human beings tend to be very optimistic. That's good. We want people to be optimistic. It helps us function better, but it can lead to problems if we're thinking, we're just not going to ever get sick. That can lead to a failure to take precautions. And if media is aware of that, it can be a helpful instrument toward longer lives.
Professor, I think just building on that, and I want to dig deeper and unpack this a little bit more. We have a question from Oliver, who's from New Zealand, and they call their prime minister there the Queen of the Nudge. But in his opinion, he believes that although she has incredible communication skills and it's difficult to understand, he wants to understand, is it difficult to understand the impact that these comments have had on the general public, as more scholars are saying that these comments can distort society's perception of the dangers and mishaps that are happening?
Okay, well, that's a great question. So you could imagine a leader who is saying that the likelihood of illness and death is much higher than it actually is. And there are a few things that are problems with that. One is to help us, we are going to get through this. It's going to be a challenge for all of us, but we're going to be fine. To give people a sense that this is, we're in a war and we're all going to die, or that's not helpful. And it also, to be frightened or hopeless is a terrible thing to do to people. And so I don't know of any leaders who are doing that, but that would be not good. Or we could imagine a leader who is underplaying the risk and saying that this isn't so bad, don't worry. And that's also not ideal, because even though it keeps people hopeful and optimistic, it prevents people from taking preventative measures. To be trusted is very important for many reasons. the most important of which is that if you're trusted, probably you're trustworthy. And if you're trustworthy, then that's because you're showing respect to citizens. And a leader may be very good or great, and part of the greatness consists in showing respect to the people you're leading, and so that's very important. If any leader is exaggerating or reducing the risk, that's not the best.
I think, Professor, just before I jump into the next question, we have the poll coming up, the results of the poll that we took at the beginning of the talk. So as you see, Professor, I'm glad that the public is extremely positive when it comes to this, but I'll give the floor to you to analyze their answer.
Okay, I think that's great, and it's very encouraging. So my reaction is that many of us have observed that there's a sense of public spiritedness that's been prompted by this. So people from all walks of life are trying to help each other. I can say just in my little neighborhood from which I'm speaking right now, there are people who are, who have very important jobs, who are going to the grocery store to get food for their elderly neighbors. And that kind of, and the elderly neighbors are both being grateful and being helpful in the ways that they can to their neighbors. And so it's one of the side benefits of a terrible threat is that people take care of each other. And my guess, it's in a way a nudge which we are all doing mutually. And that's what, I think that's what the poll is reflecting.
Professor, how can we ensure that these positive habits stay longer and beyond COVID-19, from going out and buying things for elderly neighbors to even reducing consumption of energy, and so on? So is there a way to ensure that the positive habits stay longer versus the negative ones? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, people in positions of leadership can speak about this, and that would be helpful in a way that is, we haven't seen much. So this is a very productive discussion, and your comments have made me think about it. I hadn't thought about it before, that there are norms developing now that could turn into habits that stay, or that could go away as soon as the threat is over. The way, if there's a habit, and you can give your preferred examples of habits that parents have with children, or the teachers have with students, or that we all have with one another, that are there for centuries. We have these habits. The word considerateness captures many of these habits, and for people in positions of authority to say, keep with this. Remember. Often remembering hard times can be create humility, and also can create an enduring memory of the good things that the hard times brought out.
Professor, during these changing times, I think we've seen leaders around the world with approval ratings skyrocketing, and leaders, on the other hand, not so well. What do you think is the top priorities of governments and governance during these pandemics? What should leaders take on first, and what decisions should be made? And how would that trickle down during the years?
Okay, so I would think offhand that the number one priority is to get the public health problem under control. Not through doing things that are excessive, not by saying, that people are going to be severely punished if they walk a little inch outside their home, but the strong measures to protect public health, including nudges. The second priority is to keep public morale as high as it possibly can be. to give people a sense, as some countries have successfully done, of hope, definitely, but also realistic optimism that within a relatively short period, things are going to be fine. And one reason why that's very important is if people feel angry or in despair, that makes their days much worse. It also makes them less likely to do the kinds of things they need to do to participate in a process by which the health risk is reduced quickly.
Great, Professor. Just building on a lot of the stuff we've already been talking about, there's a question from the UK, and they say, as the COVID-19 pandemic sheds light on the failings of the global system, how likely is it that moving forward, global leaders will elevate their policies? And maybe examples, Professor, that maybe you've seen of policies changing and from around the world, regulations being shifted beyond this COVID-19.
Okay, well, one that seems small, I think, but which is going to be long-term, is taking away sludge, administrative burdens, paperwork, frictions that government officials often impose for good reasons and in good faith, but which have an extremely harmful effect on citizens. So, and I'm thinking this is all over the world, even New Zealand, one of my favorite countries, where the governments often require citizens to go through certain processes. And I'm a lawyer myself, and we lawyers are often especially unable to see the negative effects of these processes that people have to go through. So a much simpler government process that's easier to navigate. I do think that's something that is coming as a result of this. Also, a renewed focus on environmental issues, insofar as there's a public health problem that comes from the environmental issues. A renewed focus on both two kinds of people, older people and people who are struggling with poverty. So those groups are especially hard hit by the pandemic. And the long-term, I think, good result would be for governments to provide a bit more help than they've provided until now.
Professor, just maybe looking at values after COVID-19, and maybe our systems and cultures have changed. In the UAE specifically, weddings and funerals have been put on. You cannot run any weddings or any funerals, and that changed the way that the culture is being done, the culture of the people, the values of the people. And like post COVID-19, how much of like the global value systems and cultural changes are going to happen? And I'm sure they're going to go in a positive manner. I think we as the UAE and some other parts of the world maybe overspend on weddings, overspend on different things, and understanding that you can have those things without the lavishness of them and the values and the cultures behind them. How would these change? And like maybe in the US, we see some different changes. In the UK, we do. In Italy, with all of the camaraderie that comes from everyone together after what happened there at the COVID-19. But I believe culture and values are going to shift and change, maybe long-term, maybe shift long-term, or maybe come back to being where they were.
Yes. So I was honored to visit the UAE and had the best time and loved the nation and really hope to go back. And so I really like the values there, and I hope they will be maintained. I think it might be useful to distinguish between the core values and the practices that the values give rise to. So there are values of celebrating marriage or celebrating events. And those may have to do with cultural commitments to very important things. And a hope is that those cultural commitments will be maintained. But you're surely right that the practices that the commitments give rise to might shift dramatically as there are, first, health risks associated with them, and second, after the health risks have been reduced, a recognition that that wasn't quite necessary. So there are some ceremonies which are so lavish and so expensive that if they were 10% less lavish or maybe 60% less lavish, people would enjoy them maybe 95% as much. And that's a good trade. 95 as much enjoyment for 40% the price. That's okay.
Professor, I think governments and governance around the world are now putting a lot of faith in people's ability to make the right choices. And I believe nudging soon is going to be able to really shift people's thoughts and ideas in the right manner. So what seems to be wrong with the command and control system, in your opinion, and when dealing with the current global catastrophe?
Okay, well, the usual reason to prefer a nudge to command and control is that people know, for many things at least, what's best for them. So if they're making a decision about what to do today or next week, they're probably making several thousand decisions. It might involve their children, it might involve their family, it might involve their friends, and they have more information than government does. So to tell them, this is what you must do at every moment, ordinarily that's not the best idea. To forbid or require some things is a good idea, but to give people some space to live their lives. It's a little like a GPS device where, the GPS device tells you how to get where you want to go. But if you want to take a different route because it's more familiar or because it's more beautiful, you're entitled to. And that's a good way to think about much of life, that the government will give you a GPS device, but at least within broad limits, you can decide what you're going to do with your day or week. But there is space, certainly in circumstances of a serious health problem, for prohibitions. So where I live right now, stores generally can't open because of the health risks. If I go out without a mask into the grocery store, that's actually a crime. I'm not allowed to do that. There are also nudges saying wear masks. There are lots of nudges, and I'm very glad for them, but they're accompanied by a requirement. My university is closed. I teach at a university. I'm not allowed to go in my university, and that's fine. And the reason why these mandates are justified is public health. That if people go to the grocery store, at least in some places right now, without a mask, they're inflicting a danger on other people. And to say you can't do that is justified. If certain places are open, restaurants are open, the health risks are in some places quite serious. And so I think in every case, there's a balance to be struck, and two things are important. One is, let's call it data, and the other, let's call it understanding. And where the prohibitions make sense, the data supports them, and the understanding is compatible with what the data suggests. Under normal circumstances, with respect to many things, if people want to not to exercise a lot, or they don't want to exercise a lot, the government doesn't say you have to play football today or you have to do exercises, and that's up to you. But you can be nudged to do those things. That's normally probably the best way.
Professor, I think one last question maybe before we close off. How has the pandemic impacted different working classes differently? And what I mean by that is there is going to be a recovery at different social statuses faster than others. And what is the long-term effect on society?
That's also a great question. And I think we should all be focusing on that right now. In different countries, the answer will be different. But in some countries, this will create especially serious problems for the working class. People who are struggling to have jobs, possibly, or struggling with their jobs, and who don't have money, they are don't have much money, they are especially vulnerable. So to attend not only to people who are really poor, and not only to people who are the elderly, but also to the working class is a very high priority. To give them opportunities, to help them economically, to give them health care and health protection, and maybe as the overriding value, to give them a sense of social respect. That's very important.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think any closing thoughts before we close this session?
Well, I think the closing thought is gratitude, both at the local level and at the kind of historic level. So the gratitude is your kindness to me and the kindness of the group. So thanks to everybody. And also a moment for gratitude that we get to be alive, and we're blessed to be participating in a solution to a historic challenge that for some people is unfortunately causing health problems, but for all of us, it's an opportunity to contribute.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I would like to take this time to thank the World Government Summit team for these amazing set of different series of talks that have been really bringing us up to speed with all of the changes that are facing the world today. I think just to wrap up some of the thoughts that I've had, it's in the end, I think one of the biggest things that I've been hearing today is talking to people, designing for hope for people, giving people a positive outcome. I think as Dubai and the UAE and places from around the world, people are looking at positive messages and positive outcomes to the changes that have been happening. And that's the only reason that I think we can propel society forward beyond just this pandemic. Like any other pandemic that has happened throughout the history, I think just positive attitude, a positive outlook, and the understanding that humanity can go and can live beyond what's happening and can definitely adapt. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I think I hand over to Reem, our host. And thank you, Professor, again. It's been a pleasure being on this call with you.
Thank you, Abdulaziz. Thank you, Professor, for joining us today and for such an insightful session. I'm going to leave everyone today with a lot of homework and thinking to do after the session. So thank you for everything. Just want to let everyone know that there's a survey right after the session, so don't log off just yet. And also our sessions for next week are going to be posted in the registration links on all our social media platforms and our website. Stay safe and take care.